Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Co-hosted by the inquisitive public speaking champion, Mike McVeigh, and energy, economics, and technology expert, Matt Jensen. Join us as we explore all things energy, economic, tech, and political, and how they will affect our future. So it's okay. So one of the things that we're discussing today is California and their solar power issues. A few years ago, approximately 20 years ago, California started working on making solar power very available for their constituents about 2006. And they did a lot of study on how much this would save and everything. But one of the things they didn't look into was what would happen when these solar panels ran out, how to get them fixed, replaced, etc. And now there's literally landfills full of solar panels. And it's very expensive to fix. The cost, and I know that sounded really scientific. There's about $2 to $4 worth of materials that are recovered from each panel that they can do without having to actually hire somebody. And then but 80 to 90% of the panels themselves can be recycled. It's just that it costs $20 to $30 to recycle a panel versus $1 to $2 to send it to a landfill. And if recycling isn't as
the problem
great,
with consumerism, right there.
Yes. It costs more. I don't want to do it. And this is kind of a redo for some of you that are listening. We had a really brilliant session recorded last time and found out the recording button didn't work on my side. So all this beautiful information I said last week, you're just going to have to trust that I actually sounded brilliant for what's on this podcast. But Matt, why don't you take it at this point and make me look better?
That's funny. Well, yeah, part of the reason we're talking about this is we read an article that was in Yahoo that it's called California Went Big on Rooftop Solar, and now that's a problem for landfills. And it touches on one of the topics that I think we talk about probably a lot, if not the majority on here, is that renewables sometimes don't factor in a lot of the waste components of it, and that a lot of the energy transition, if you're talking about going to solar and wind, requires a lot of toxic materials and assumptions that there's going to be recycling technology that's not really present yet. So it's a tough spot. And within this too, one thing lately was the EU's considering labeling lithium, which is a big component in batteries, as a toxic substance. This could, potentially have some hurdles there for trade and transport within the EU. So I think generally a lot of people recognize that unless these are not disposed of properly, then they have issues with it, like being put in landfills where they have the potential of polluting groundwater with toxic materials. Some of you of our listeners have maybe read about or seen the pictures of horror stories where there's just piles of solar panels dumped in landfills down in Africa, just out in the open, in puddles, polluting everything. And we've talked a little bit about kind of like the not in my backyard ism of stuff, and it's difficult. So solar panels and wind turbines probably last 20 to 30 years, and then they're basically ineffective and need to be thrown away. Like you were talking about earlier, that it costs, $20 $20 or so to properly recycle 80% of a solar panel. With wind turbines, it's the same thing too. You have a lot of materials that are kind of intermixed, and it's just not, it's basically cost prohibitive to do it. So they're not being recycled for their materials.
Right.
With wind turbines, there's been some repurposing of the turbines into other things. But it's just not really, it's not really a green sort of energy, in my opinion, if it, on the disposal, it pollutes groundwater sources.
Right. It goes back to the documentary that Michael Moore produced that we've talked about in detail on this podcast, that it's almost the idea that it's green energy or reusable or recyclable energy that almost gets it off the hook for actually having to be responsible. I think of it similar to a paycheck, and I'm not downing people that are in these situations, but it's someone that has a decent job and keeps on buying more stuff and then asks their boss for an advance so they can get through the next month, only to ask for another advance. And so this time we're applying it to the real world, to climate, to actual geographical resources. And we're like, hey, we just need a little bit more to get through. It's not actually saving. It's not helping with energy. It's not clean. It's not, it's actually costing more than the savings it brought. And this is something that I don't think either of us was expecting when we started doing the podcast together, that we were going to keep on coming to these conclusions that some of the things that are touted as being the best for the environment, that the most environmentally friendly things are actually some of the worst things for the environment.
It just depends, right? Like, how are they disposed? Where are they disposed?
And there's all the different factors. I mean,
they're definitely lower emission, but it's kind of like, I think very, very rarely do we have that discussion of kind of like all the pros and cons in an unemotional manner, where you kind of really get to reality of how this is working and how you want it to work.
Right.
Because if it's, if you're spending all this money transitioning your grid, there should be a lot of thought on basically getting the things needed in place and using government funding or whatever to really put in that supply chain kind of recycling infrastructure and to really do that. And I do recognize that there's a lot of new technologies that have come about that are helping in this manner, but there's also some really exciting stuff in processing traditional stuff, like bacteria that eats plastic and stuff like that, where it's kind of like, it just reminds me of orphan wells. So there's like millions of wells all over the United States that have been drilled over the last 100 something years, and new wells are, they're really well cased. They're a lot, I guess, more environmentally friendly than these old wells, but these orphan wells, nobody knows where they are. Basically, there's no sort of tracking mechanism to them. They might just be like a little hole in the ground that you don't even know that it's there unless you were basically using some special cameras to see like methane emissions bubbling out of like a creek or something like that.
Right.
So I kind of feel like we're in an area kind of like we were in oil and gas before, where there was just, it was like, let's just do it and then figure it out later in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that also, so part of it's weird. It's kind of like deja vu, but not quite, since we've covered this to an extent. But so California, if California is the only problem, then we could just go, those stupid Californians. But they did do a study, and it looked like a new solar project was installed in the United States every 60 seconds in 2021.
Wow, that's amazing.
And this is given by the Solar Energy and Industries Association. and they're expecting it to rise quadruple in size between 2020 and 2030. And I want to also say, if I remember correctly, yes, We Recycle Solar is one of the major companies that is benefiting from this, and they do. I think I can't find the numbers. I know they're there last week, but they do a high portion of all of the business that is of what's getting installed and everything. So it's not just, government might have made a mistake or whatever, but it's somebody else that's definitely reaping the benefits of this and taking it literally as far as possible and kind of like, damn the cost, full speed ahead. So some of the reasons why this is a big deal: recycling solar panels aren't simple. It requires specialized equipment and workers with a certain kind of training to be able to separate the different pieces. And some of those pieces include an aluminum frame and a junction box. And they have to be able to remove it in a way that it doesn't shatter the panels into glass shards. And that's why I don't do the job, because it would shatter just me looking at it. They also have to use some specialized furnaces to help recover the silicon. And the panels themselves are classified as hazardous materials in most of the states of the United States. Yeah. So we already have like a double problem.
Yeah, I know.
Then you type in the restrictions on packaging, transporting, and this kind of stuff. It's really crazy how much it is, but how much work it is to save it. But as you mentioned earlier, part of it's poor planning, and I think it's interesting that this actually happened under a Republican administration. And I think knowing
you're assuming that any politician is good at foresight.
Well,
right?
no, because this usually comes from like people on the left usually pushing for this kind of stuff. I mean, that's at least what we hear. I think from reading from this article and some other stuff, it seems like it was something that was done in good faith. Like this would actually be a really good thing. It's just, presidents don't think more than 8 years beyond where they are regarding this kind of stuff. And
I think it's a lot easier to just get something out there and get funding behind a idea rather than get into the nuts and bolts. And that's kind of like I would say a key difference between us and China. You look at China, they can get a building built in 5 days, like a giant apartment building. So at least the outside structure for it. And it's just, our system, I don't think always leads to great policy and foresight and long-term thinking. So,
and that's kind of the rub. I mean, we talk about business as well, how businesses can be successful. And this is, when we talked about Twitter with Elon Musk's acquisition or lack thereof, that, this is a good time to jump in and stuff. And that's kind of the rub. When you jump in, you're not going to know all the consequences ahead of time. And I don't want to bash one side or the other. Obviously, this is very costly and is going to do some major damage.
Problems are always opportunities for businesses to meet consumer needs.
Should be,
so.
Yes. However, there was a note that you made that says it's not really green if it pollutes water sources. I was like, unless it makes it green water.
Yeah, I hope not. Well, one of the things I was thinking, right, is oil and gas wells. You basically have to pay money for bonding or set aside money into a plugging fund, and that money is basically run by the state, and it ensures that there's money set aside to plug a well, even if you go bankrupt. It almost makes sense in the situation if there were to be like a solar tax on purchase, kind of like, when I was in the Netherlands, there was a bottle tax. So you would essentially pay, like if you bought beer or you bought some sort of bottled drink, you would pay like a certain cents basically per each bottle. And if you brought back those back to the grocery store in kind of the crates, you would put them through this machine and they would kick you back some of the money. So if it would, you know, it would make sense to kind of have some sort of tax on the onset that would set aside money to help fund for some of the future disposal and ensure that kind of the actual recycling capacity exists to recycle it at the end of its useful cycle. And also, you know, that money is basically, it's kind of like Social Security in a way. If your Social Security is basically funded by the people paying into it now, for the most part. So it would provide funds to build up recycling now when you need it, for basically spend coming before. Because I genuinely think most people either or use solar because of environmental things, like they really want to lower emissions, or they just want to basically be off the grid. And like I think in both cases, if it was well communicated, a lot of those solar panels would end up in areas where they could be more recycled. And also, you know, one thing that I think about a lot is there's this talk about carbon capture, and I don't know if it necessarily relates to this, but I know New York has built a giant plant to basically burn all their trash. If you can just incinerate this and scrub the emissions in some way where it's not going to pollute the environment, that might be sometimes your best scenario rather than trying to save stuff. Because from that, you know, the metal can be dripped out and separated, I believe. So
just have to have a lot of trees around there to soak up the carbon dioxide. I know that's something that we're going to be looking into further in the future. So stay tuned for that episode.
But before we go, it does remind me of the plastics in the Philippines, where after China said no go to sending all their plastic over there, I think in like 2016 or something, started sending it to a lot of recyclers in the Philippines, where they subsequently kept all the money and just dumped it in the ocean. So I think it's important for us to think about where our trash goes, especially when it's toxic, and get out of this cycle where we just send it overseas to poorer countries and hope that they deal with it in a socially conscious manner. Because, you know, rarely that happens, and rarely is there actually good protocols to make sure that it's done in an environmentally sensitive or environmentally conscious manner.
If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.